You can't give that which you have not. On the Rwandan youth, Kagame, Himbara, and the long memory of a broken country. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Chapter 1. The name we don't say. They say no one remembers being born, but I do. Not the moment, not the blood, not the light, but the feeling of arriving after something had already ended, into smoke, into aftermath, into memory that wasn't mine but lived in every silence I breathed. I came into a world already mourning itself, already broken into parts that would never quite fit again. They named the year 1994. Rwanda called it a turning point, though I've never trusted words that smooth over pain. I only know that I inherited the ashes. I inherited the ashes. The sky itself must have cracked open that year. Blood ran through the streets like language no one could translate. Mothers carried children who would not wake. Fathers became ghosts before their sons could learn their names. I don't remember any of it, of course, but memory like that doesn't ask for permission. It waits in your breath, in your posture, in the weight of being born where the world was ending. Not that I remember any of it, of course. No one remembers their own birth, but some of us are born into memory anyway. Not the warm kind that families share over fires. No, I mean the memory that waits for you in silence, in the way people avert their eyes, in the way they lower their voices, in the way names are not spoken. My country burned the year I was born. It still smokes, and I still breathe it. We ran, like everyone else. Burundi, Tanzania, Malawi, that was the order. We were always moving, always half unpacking, half expecting to leave again. A refugee is not a person. A refugee is paperwork and waiting. I was a number before I was a name, a shape before I was a child. But even in the camps, even as a number, I heard it. The name, Kagame, Paul Kagame. They taught it to us in school, even outside Rwanda. The liberator, the general, the man who ended the killing and built the nation. I believed it. We all did. You would too if you were 8 years old and hungry and needed someone to believe in. Kagame was a myth wearing a suit. On television, he stood stiff as marble, flanked by soldiers and ministers, his voice flat, his promises clean and measured, like blueprints for a nation. But behind him, you could almost see the cracks, faces blurred in fear, names no longer spoken, headlines swallowed whole. He walked taller than other men. He didn't smile. People called that discipline. We said his name like we were afraid it might echo, and maybe it would. Maybe it still does. In the camps, you learned quickly that even safety had rules. And one rule was this: do not speak badly of Kagame. Not even a joke. Not even a whisper. Especially not a whisper. But I am not so good with rules. Not forever. I was a quiet child, yes. But quiet doesn't mean blind. Silence was my first language. It was not neutral, not absence. It had a will. It watched me. It studied me. I used to imagine it sitting on my chest at night, a black dog with no face, breathing slow and heavy, daring me to move. I learned to negotiate with it. If I stayed still, if I stayed quiet, it might let me sleep. In school, it shadowed my thoughts. I knew answers, but said nothing. I imagined the words crawling back down my throat, afraid of the air. When I looked at the other children, I could see it in them too. Some had made peace with it. Others, like me, were still learning how to keep their face from betraying the rebellion of the mind. Silence was not just something around us. It was something we became. It filled the tent at night, thick and absolute, where even a cough seemed rebellious. It walked with me to school, sat with me in the back row, and wrapped itself around my throat when the teacher asked questions with only one acceptable answer. I learned that silence was not emptiness. It was weight. It pressed itself into the corners of every conversation, into the pauses too long and the answers too rehearsed. It taught me not just what could not be said, but what must be erased even from thought. I began to notice the way adults glanced around before saying his name, the way they paused mid-sentence as if thinking better of something, the way stories ended too soon. That kind of silence is its own kind of noise. You hear it more when you know what to listen for. I began to notice the way adults glanced around before saying his name, the way they paused mid-sentence as if thinking better of something, the way stories ended too soon. That kind of silence is its own kind of noise. You hear it more when you know what to listen for. One day, I wrote his name in a notebook. I remember how my hand shook just a little, just enough to betray me to myself. It was as if I were watching someone else, some other boy, reckless or brave or stupid, defy the sacred hush with ink, a tremor born not from cold, but from contradiction. I felt like a thief in my own mind. The feeling didn't end with the burning of that page. It followed me to bed, crept into my dreams, sat in the back of my thoughts like a witness waiting to testify. I began to see hesitation in others too, as if I now carried a secret weight that gave me X-ray vision for their silences. I trusted less, spoke less. Every conversation became a chessboard, every glance a potential threat. Even as a child, I started to ask myself, had I crossed some invisible line, or had I simply noticed it for the first time? Who was I to question the man who ended the killing? Who was I to write his name without permission? And yet I did. And yet I could not stop. It was a small heresy, but it split my sense of self in two. The boy who obeyed, and the boy who was beginning to ask why. The letters came out too bold, too final. It felt like I had conjured something, not written it, but summoned it. Kagame. A name made of iron and breath. I stared at it as if it might open its mouth and accuse me, as if it might leap from the page and turn me in. My heart beat harder, and not from guilt, from the fear of knowing something was wrong and that I had just put it in ink. I stared at it, just the name, just the 5 letters, like a riddle, K-A-G-A-M-E. It looked powerful, like it could blink, as if the letters themselves had grown eyes, accusing, unblinking, and cold. My mind played tricks on me then. Or maybe it wasn't a trick. Maybe the name was watching me. Maybe it always had. I felt suddenly that I had written a curse, not a word. I half expected the ink to move, to snake off the page and whisper what I had done into someone's ear. I knew, even as a child, that words could be dangerous. But this felt like I had summoned something that could not be unsummoned. I tore the page out and burned it in a plastic bucket. Not because I was told to, because I needed to, because the paper felt heavier than it should have. Years passed. In 2014, I got access to a computer, an online scholarship, Regis University, Denver, liberal arts. It sounded like magic, and in a way, it was. I turned on the machine and the world spilled out. History, books, news. And then, an article, a name. Not Kagame. Another name. Professor David Himbara. His name startled me, not with awe, but with a sharp, skeptical curiosity. I paused. I had learned by then to be wary of strong opinions, even the ones that claimed to tell the truth. Was he another bitter exile, another voice trapped in grievance? But I read on, and something in the tone, the restraint, the evidence, the refusal to shout, disarmed me. It didn't arrive with fanfare or force, but it landed like a truth I had been aching to hear. He wasn't just another critic. I could feel it immediately. There was something steady, something disciplined in the way he peeled back the layers of power. I felt like I had just found a map out of the fog. I don't know what I expected. Another exile writing complaints? Another man angry at power because it didn't love him back? No. What I found was precision, facts sharp enough to cut marble. This man had worked with Kagame, had sat beside him, had written his speeches, and had walked away. He wrote what no one else would, about the lies, about the vanishings, about the numbers Kagame worshipped, and the bodies those numbers hid. He wrote without apology. That was what struck me, not the rage, the clarity. I read everything I could find, downloaded, saved, reread. The fear didn't go away, but something else grew louder, the urge to answer, not with slogans, with stories, with facts, with memory. I began to write, but not like a writer, more like a man clawing at the walls of his own skull. I had to, because once you see the wires behind the puppet, you cannot pretend it dances on its own. And yet I doubted every word. I asked myself, was this bravery or vanity? Was I bearing witness, or was I just angry that I had been fooled? I would write a sentence and erase it, rewrite it, erase it again. I was terrified not only of being wrong, but of being right. Write about the things no one wants to hear. I watched my own hands, like they didn't belong to me, like they were pulling truth out of my chest, against my will. I was no hero. I was a boy in a war of shadows, scribbling in secret, hoping no one noticed, and also hoping everyone did. Kagame built a nation on silence, the same silence I learned to fear as a child, the silence that pressed against my ears when someone said his name too loud, the silence that followed questions no one would answer. Professor Himbara taught me how to speak, but I do not worship men. I do not put them on pedestals. He was not a saint. He did not ask to be followed. What I saw in him was not a savior, but a man committed, perhaps obsessively, to telling the truth. That exile did not have to mean erasure or submission. I had always feared that to leave Rwanda, to live outside its borders, was to live in a kind of moral limbo, untethered, invisible. But in him I saw something different. A man who had carried his homeland with him, not in nostalgia, but in defiance. He didn't adapt to exile. He confronted it. He didn't dilute his truth to fit the comfort of his new home. He sharpened it. Watching him, reading him, I began to understand that exile can be a crucible, a place where conviction is either forged or lost. And through him, I chose to forge mine. Every paragraph he wrote felt like a mirror turned back on the regime, but also on me. He forced me to confront what I had feared. That silence was not innocence. That complicity is not always active. Sometimes it is passive, polite, well-dressed. He reminded me that to write is to testify, and to testify is to betray the machinery of forgetting. I remember one sentence he wrote that refused to leave me. A nation that silences its thinkers is building monuments on quicksand. I read that line over and over, as if decoding something sacred. It made me realize that forgetting isn't passive. It is engineered. It has architects. It has blueprints. and it is in the interest of power to ensure no one asks about the missing bricks. In his example, I found not a hero to follow, but a set of principles to wrestle with. There were moments I disagreed with his conclusions or felt uneasy about how forcefully he exposed certain things. I remember reading one critique and thinking, was this too sharp? Was it necessary to strip every layer so bare? But the discomfort wasn't about him. It was about the truths I wasn't ready to face. His ideas pushed me not toward agreement, but toward interrogation. That's what I respected most. He did not want disciples. He wanted readers who thought. I did not always agree with him, but I respected what he made visible, the space between the myth and the machinery. His work illuminated the possibility of a Rwanda led by someone trained not to dominate, but to serve, someone with the discipline of study, the humility of data, and the burden of conscience. I respected the ideas more than the man, and perhaps that is the highest kind of respect, because once you know, you cannot unknow, and once you can speak, you must. But speaking is not free. It is not heroic. It is a wound you agree to keep open. I lost friends. Some faded politely, others vanished coldly. I learned to watch my tone in conversations, to gauge who was listening even in safe rooms. I began to sleep with caution. I wondered whether my family would be blamed for what I had dared to write. And yet, even in fear, I never felt more alive. Speaking cost me comfort, but it gave me purpose. It stripped away illusions and left only the truth, terrible, luminous, and mine. But where does such silence come from? Who shapes it? Who teaches a nation not to speak? And worse, who learns it so well they begin teaching it themselves without even meaning to? I ask, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who suspects he may have carried that silence like an inheritance, polished it like an heirloom, passed it along without noticing. It is easy to condemn the mechanisms from a distance. Harder to admit when the mechanism has been living inside you all along. I wrote, yes, but did I always speak when I should have? Did I question early enough, clearly enough? Or did I wait until it was safe to say what I already knew? These questions would haunt me more deeply than I expected. I had written a name in a notebook, but the name had a history, and the silence around it had an architect. The name no longer belonged to me, if it ever had. It had been seized by myth, paraded through polished speeches, buried beneath statistics and security checkpoints. What I wrote that day wasn't a word, but a fragment of something stolen, something corrupted, something that once meant hope and now meant control. The name had become a monument, but I could still feel the blood in its foundation. If I wanted to understand the weight I was carrying, I would need to go back to before the exile, before the myths, before the polished speeches. I would have to look at the boys who grew up in the dust of another country. One of them would become the president, the other, my teacher. It almost sounds like a parable, doesn't it? Two exiled boys, one learns how to rule, the other how to question. One builds a state from silence, the other breaks it with sentences. Exile carved them both, but in opposite directions. One toward control, the other toward clarity. And somehow I find myself walking between them, haunted by both their shadows, both born into loss, both shaped by exile, and both, in their own way, still trying to return.